You're lying in bed, the room is dark, the day is over, and then, out of nowhere, it starts. A sentence from hours ago, your reply. The pause before they answered, the tone they used on one specific word, and suddenly you're not in your bed anymore. You're back in that conversation, editing it, rebuilding it, running it again from the beginning, looking for something you can't even name. Here's what makes this so disturbing. It wasn't even an important conversation, not a breakup, not a fight. Maybe it was just lunch with a coworker, a text exchange, a passing comment from someone you care about. 30 seconds of human interaction, and somehow your brain has turned it into a 4-hour project. You know it's over. You know replaying it changes nothing. You know the other person has almost certainly moved on. And yet your mind refuses to accept that information. It keeps returning anyway, circling the same moment like it's waiting for something to shift. Why? Why can't you just let it go? Because your mind isn't broken. It's doing something very specific. And once you understand what that is, everything starts to make a different kind of sense. Most people assume this is about insecurity. That you replay conversations because you're too sensitive, too self-conscious, too caught up in what others think of you. And yes, that's part of it, but it's only the surface. The deeper truth is this: you are not replaying the conversation because you're vain or fragile. You're replaying it because you didn't feel safe enough to be fully present while it was happening. And so now, your mind goes back, not to admire itself, not to perform for an invisible audience, to check for danger. Think about what you actually do during social interactions. You stay composed, you read the room in real time, you choose your words carefully, not just for meaning, but for tone, for timing, for how they'll land. You track how the other person is feeling while simultaneously managing how you come across. You notice the small shifts, a slight tension in their voice, a pause that lasts a beat too long, a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. You are performing a kind of invisible labor, constantly, automatically, and so fluently that you don't even notice you're doing it. Then the conversation ends. The other person leaves. You close the door, you make tea, or check your phone, or stare at the ceiling. And only then, only when the performance is no longer required, does your system finally have enough space to process what just happened. The feelings arrive late. The doubt arrives late. The details start glowing with a significance they didn't seem to have in the moment. This isn't overthinking in the shallow sense. This is delayed processing. For some people, the conversation doesn't really happen until afterward. The real experience, the full emotional weight of it, only lands once you're alone and the guard is finally down. Now here's where it gets personal, because people don't all replay conversations the same way, and the specific thing you replay tells you something important about what your system is actually trying to protect. Some people replay their own words, obsessively, mercilessly. Did I say too much? Not enough? Did I sound desperate, cold, rehearsed? Was that joke actually funny, or did I just think it was? These are the people who go home and quietly wish they could reach back into the conversation and surgically remove one sentence. Some people replay the other person's tone, not the words, the tone. That 1-second pause before they answered. The way they said okay in a way that didn't quite sound like okay. The look that crossed their face for half a moment before they smiled. These people aren't reacting to what was said. They're reacting to what they think was meant underneath it. And then there's the third kind, the hardest kind. The people who replay the moment they felt exposed, when something slipped through that they hadn't intended to reveal, when a nerve got touched and their reaction gave them away, when they sounded more vulnerable, more eager, more wounded than they wanted to. That kind of replay isn't just reviewing a conversation, it's watching yourself inside it, studying your own reactions like evidence in a case you're building against yourself. That is self-surveillance. And it is one of the more exhausting things a person can do without realizing they're doing it, especially if you grew up learning to be careful around people, especially if reading the room wasn't a social skill you developed. It was something you needed for safety. When the emotional temperature of a room could shift fast, and you learned early to track every signal, every tone, every micro-expression. Those people don't just have conversations, they have threat assessments disguised as conversations. And the part of the mind that learned to do that doesn't switch off just because you walked out the door. So, what is your brain actually looking for when it keeps running the loop? Certainty. It wants to close the file. It wants to know, how was I received? Was that irritation in their voice, or just tiredness? Was the silence comfortable, or did something shift? Did I come across the way I meant to? But here's the problem. Human interaction is almost never that clean. There is too much ambiguity, too much that neither person says directly, too much you will simply never know for certain, and so the mind does what minds do with anything unfinished. It reopens it. It runs it one more time, and then one more time after that, looking for a resolution that isn't there, and the more emotionally depleted you are, the worse it gets. When you're burned out, or lonely, or already stretched thin, your system has less margin to absorb uncertainty. Small social moments start to feel much larger than they are because you don't have the internal space to let them pass through cleanly. Instead of moving through you, they get lodged. A look, a silence, a sentence. They stay. This is why replaying conversations often intensifies during difficult periods in life. Not because you're suddenly weaker, but because your buffer is gone. There's nothing left to cushion the ambiguity. But here's something that gets missed in most conversations about this, and it matters. Not every replay is fear-based. Sometimes you replay a conversation because it mattered to you more than you want to admit, because you cared genuinely and deeply how that person saw you, because something in the exchange stirred something old, hope, or shame, or longing, or a tenderness you didn't expect to feel in a Tuesday afternoon conversation about nothing in particular. People don't only replay bad conversations, they replay charged ones, unfinished ones, ones that touched something deeper than the surface words could carry, and your mind keeps returning to them not to punish you, but because it's trying to honor that weight, because something real happened there, even if you can't quite name it, even if the other person has no idea. That's not a flaw. That's what it feels like to be someone who actually feels things. The problem isn't that. The problem is when the replay stops being a form of processing and becomes a form of entrapment. There is a real difference between reflection and entrapment. Reflection visits a moment, takes what's useful, and lets you move forward. It has a direction. It resolves into something: clarity, understanding, acceptance, even just a quiet, okay, I see what happened there. Entrapment circles. It visits the same moment again and again, convinced that one more pass will finally produce the certainty it needs. It never does. It just deepens the groove, makes the moment feel more significant than it was, keeps you psychologically living inside an interaction that is physically long over. And slowly, invisibly, every conversation starts to have a second life inside your head. The external conversation ends, but the internal one begins. And the internal version is louder, longer, and somehow more real than the original ever was. That is an exhausting way to move through the world. So the next time the loop starts, and it will start, try asking yourself one honest question before you follow it down. Am I trying to understand something real, or am I trying to rescue myself from the discomfort of not knowing exactly how I was seen? Because that discomfort, that not knowing, isn't actually a problem to be solved. It's the natural residue of human contact. We are all partially opaque to each other. Every conversation leaves something unresolved. That is not failure. That is just the honest texture of being two people trying to connect across the gap. The healthiest shift isn't finding the perfect interpretation of what happened. It's deciding that uncertainty is not the same as danger. You don't have to stop caring. You don't have to become someone who floats through interactions untouched. You're allowed to feel things. You're allowed to care how you come across. You're allowed to notice the pause, the tone, the look. You just don't have to treat every open question like a wound that needs closing before you're allowed to rest. because the conversation is over. You were there. You said what you said. You showed up as the complicated, imperfect, trying their best person that you are. And that is enough. You're allowed to come home now. If this resonated, tell me in the comments what you replay most. Your own words, their tone, an awkward moment, or the fear that you were misunderstood. And subscribe if you want more of this.